Welcome to another inspirational message from Chowdean Community Church, Gateshead. For more information about Chowdean, visit www.chowdean.org.uk. We hope you enjoy the podcast.
(1 Samuel 17). It's not all consecutive, so there's a few bits missed out. It is quite a long reading, so I will read through it, and if you want to follow, it's in 1 Samuel 17. I'm reading from the NIV. I believe it's going to appear on the screen behind me, which is good because I'm seeing thumbs up at the back, which is a good sign. So we'll read this in preparation, then I'll invite Heather up to bring the word of the Lord to us. The Philistines occupied one hill, and the Israelites another, with the valley in between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale, armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are, and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elath, fighting against the Philistines." Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out, as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This will be done for the man who kills him." Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistines, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword nor spears that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him, reaching into his bag. And taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down onto the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. Let's pray for Heather as she comes to.
It's nice to see a few visitors with us today, especially those ladies from the Cafe Group who I'm delighted to see here today. So as Seth says, we're starting a new series today, Destroying Your Giants. It's still following the theme that Terry introduced to us in January, Jesus, our giant slayer, and looking at the story of David and Goliath. Now, the giants that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks are fear, rejection, anger, addiction, and comfort. And this has been inspired by a book by Louis Giglio, Goliath Must Fall, where he emphasizes the point in the story that Jesus is David, we are not David trying to fight the giants in our life. Jesus is our giant slayer. So we'll get that right at the beginning. We are not David, Jesus is. Now, the other speakers who are following on will be looking at one of those giants each week in more depth and unpacking the scriptures. So I thought, well, how can I just give an overview of these today? And I remember at our recent church weekend that Pastor Paul Reed said, when he was talking about church culture, we need first and foremost to be authentic and admit our own struggles. And then I read Martin Lloyd-Jones, who said that today people are less concerned with is it true, but rather does it work? Now, of course, it does matter that it's true, but does Christianity work in your life? Does Christianity work in my life? Have I proved by experience that Jesus is my giant slayer? Now, of necessity, in order to be authentic and real, we have to make ourselves vulnerable. So I'm hoping that by the end of this morning, I still have some friends left. So we're going to start off with the giant of fear. As Terry said at the beginning of the year, we're not so much talking about normal fears, but the kind of fear that becomes a phobia, that's irrational and illogical, the kind that produces anxiety disorder and panic attacks. Now, I don't like flying. I'm afraid of flying. But when I've had to, I've done it. I don't like the technology at the ladies' cafe because no matter how carefully we prepare the program and practice at home, so often we get there and the technology fails, and you're left standing like a fool in front of a room full of women. But that doesn't stop me from doing it. What I want to share with you today is the kind of fear which is out of control and prevents you from living normally. This happened to me in 84-85. I'd been a Christian for a year when Colin became a Christian, my husband, so that was obviously very exciting. But around the same time, in fact the same week, my grandmother died, and we'd been close. And I realise now that as a new Christian, believing in eternal life, I didn't grieve properly. And even as Christians, we should be able to properly mourn our loved ones. A short time after that, I felt ill one Sunday evening during the church service, and I had to walk out of the meeting. And I felt a bit embarrassed to get up and walk out. But that is when the phobia began. Now, Goliath didn't start off being 9 feet tall. He started small. And that's the same with all giants. After that, if I was in a group of people, the church service, Kathy's Bible study group, my heart would be racing, palms sweaty, imagining I was going to be ill and I would have to get up. Now, I could tell myself that it was ridiculous, that nothing was going to happen. But it grew until I feared the fear. I didn't want to go out, and I was heading towards agoraphobia. Now, Louis Giglio in the book points out that anxiety disorder is not the result of one thing or one moment, but a combination of lots of things that fester over time. This went on for about a year, praying and asking God for help. Now, I've had my ups and downs in life, as I'm sure you all have, but I can honestly say that that was the worst year of my life. And I think it was made worse because I didn't tell anybody. As Paul Badams pointed out to us when he was speaking about Daniel, we always think we're the only person who ever suffered like that. I didn't tell anyone because I thought that if people thought that I was mentally unstable, then they wouldn't believe what I said about Jesus being alive. I thought that anxiety would spoil my testimony. After a year, it was the church weekend away at Otterburn Hall, and I wanted to go, but I didn't know how I would cope. And all the way there in the car, I was fighting this giant. Now, at the weekend, Jeff Smith's mum, Muriel, used to have a bookstall, and I bought a little book called God Has the Answer to Your Problems. And in this book, there was a chapter on irrational fear, which described exactly how I was feeling and why. And you know, it was such a relief to know that I wasn't the only person in the world who had ever felt like that. And I wasn't going insane. The answer was just to do what God asked you to do. Just do it. You had to be brave, but just do it. Don't stop going to church. Don't stop going to the Bible study. Face the fear and do it. Now, it didn't go away overnight, But over a period of time, it did fade. And just knowing I wasn't the only person and believing that God did have the answer worked. The giant was defeated. Now, I'm not saying that God works in the same way for everyone. David had 5 smooth stones. If the first one hadn't worked, perhaps he would have tried a different one, because God treats us all as individuals, but that worked for me. In his book, Louis Giglio tells of his anxiety disorder, which led to a mental and emotional breakdown, for which he had to have medication from his doctor, and there's nothing wrong with that. What I learned from his book, and what Terry mentioned to us in his introduction, is that fear is not a thing. It's a symptom of a thing, or several things, and we need to dig down and get to the root of the matter. Louis Giglio realized that it was his desire to be in control of everything and wanting the approval of others that led to his breakdown. And I could see the same things in myself. But as he writes in the book, when have we ever truly been in control? God is in control, and he is bigger than our fears, and he has a good plan for us. The next giant is rejection. And this was quite a big one in my life. Starting small, as all giants do, but growing over the years. My parents, who used to be in this church, many of you will remember, were good people, but they rarely gave praise because they didn't want my sister and I to be big-headed. And my mother always told me that my sister was Dad's favourite. And you know, I have a sneaky suspicion that my dad really would have preferred a boy. And I get this idea from a poem he wrote when he about his first experiences of being a first-time father. Now, it was written in the Geordie dialect, so I'm going to read it as my dad wrote it, and you'll get the drift. Apologies to those listening on the podcast for the Geordie dialect. I'd only been married, nae more than a couple of years. I didn't know very much because I'd never been married before. When the wife says, I think I'll pay the doctor a visit. I says, are you not well? Are you poorly? Where is it? Oh, I'm all right. Just a bit of sickness in the morning. No, I knew this much. This was some kind of warning. Do you think you could be, like, whatever next? The word is pregnant, and what did you expect? If the doctor confirms what it is, I'll call at the store for some wool. Will I get blue or pink? No, hinny, there's no doubt in my mind at all. I'm away to buy him football boots and a ball. And then a bit later, when the time's approaching, I'll get football books on training and coaching. We thought of some names like Arthur, Howard or Algernon, but finally decided on no-nonsense, straightforward John. But the crowd, when he's famous, will all know him best as War Jackie. I'll have to keep him clear of women and drinking and knee smoking baccy. I can see him now, his future all mapped out ahead. Liverpool and Man United will want him, but he'll sign for Newcastle instead. The coaching and training will all go to plan as he dribbles down the field, beating man after man. Me reverie was halted when the wife's pains got worse. I had to run for Miss Rogers, the district nurse. I paced up and down, me mind in a muddle, the sweat teeming down, even causing a puddle. I went outside, then you weren't allowed in, when I heard this babby making such a terrible din. I was smoking fag after fag, though I knew I should know it, when I heard Nurse Rogers say, it's a lovely daughter. It's a what? I want a second opinion. Give the doctor a call. And what about the football boots and the ball? I contemplated suicide. I was at the end of me tether. Still, we'll have to make the best of it and we'll call her Heather. Now, it was light-hearted, but when he was elderly and I was going every day to care for him, I did say, just light-heartedly one day, I bet you're glad you had a girl now, because a boy wouldn't look after you like this. Quick as a flash, he came back and said, no, but his wife would. Now, I don't think he meant it, but I think it just sticks a little bit. My granddaughters tell me, and I'm not sure if boys think like this, that there's a group of people in every year group who are called the populars. They're not always the best looking, although mostly, not always the best, brightest academically or especially good at sports, but they are the ones that everybody wants to hang out with. Some are popular for all the wrong reasons, but they're still in with the in crowd and invited to everybody's party. That has never been me. I remember, and this is a painful memory, so be sympathetic, that at the old-fashioned grammar school that I went to, the Christmas parties, we did country dancing. Dances with names which would be considered politically incorrect today, but we danced Strip the Willow and the Gay Gordons. Now, that wasn't too bad because you danced in groups, but then a boy had to ask a girl to walk into the dining hall in pairs. This was first and second year when you were about 12, 13, and it was agony sitting there watching the nice-looking boys picking other girls, and then even the not-so-nice-looking boys choosing someone else. And the most embarrassing thing, the ultimate shame, was if you weren't chosen. And there were always more girls than boys, so you had to walk at the end of the queue with another girl who wasn't also chosen. 2 years running! And I can tell you, that scars you for life. I feigned illness in the third year. By the time I got to the fourth and fifth year, I'd learned how to be popular with the boys and was wearing the tightest dress I could get into, stiletto heels and makeup. But seriously, I would say to any young women who are listening on the podcast, that is a surefire way to learn even more about rejection. Perhaps it's different for the boys, but Rob Parsons has a lovely poem in one of his books about teams. It says, when we pick teams in the playground, whatever the game might be, there's always somebody left to last, and usually it's me. I stand there looking hopeful and tapping myself on the chest, but the captains pick the others first, starting, of course, with the best. Maybe if teams were picked, starting with the worst, once in his life a boy like me could end up being first. And one child said, heaven is a place where there are no teams and nobody ever gets picked last. Now, I could go on about being divorced and, all the other things, but I want to get to the good bit where Jesus is our giant slayer. About 88, 9, 90, Colin and I were asked to go as counsellors to a Christian camp. It was camping in tents and caravans, and there was a big tent for the evening meetings. The plan was that each evening after the speaker had preached, there would be an appeal for people to go forward for prayer. We would then move to the front, find someone of the same sex and roughly the same age, and pray for them. Now, I was pretty nervous because I was new to this, but on the first night I was there full of faith and trusting what God would do. I moved forward and spoke to this lady, a little bit older than me, a bit posh, and I was all fired up and ready to listen to her, but she refused to speak to me. I wasn't important enough, and she wanted to speak to the camp pastor. So then I had to go and find somebody else and get them to speak to her. Now, that lady was a total stranger to me. She was nothing to me, but it had a real impact. The campsite was dark, so I stumbled back to the caravan, sat in the dark, and sobbed for all the times in my life when I had felt rejected or I didn't fit in. And the Holy Spirit brought things to my mind I hadn't thought about in years. Now, it was the custom at this camp to have hot chocolate at the end of the day in village groups, so small groups of people, and people would share what God had been doing during the day. I crept out of the caravan and I stayed in the shadows because I didn't want anybody to see that I'd been crying. But of course, you can't hide from God in the shadows. One of the men there, who couldn't have known what had happened, couldn't have known how I was feeling, had what the Bible calls a word of knowledge from God. And he said, there's somebody here who was feeling hurt by rejection. Well, I have to be honest and say I was absolutely amazed. But people came and they prayed for me, and I was given a prophecy from God which has stayed with me ever since. Knowing that God knows how we feel and knowing that we are accepted and loved by him is liberating. Over the years since then, there have been times when I still have felt that I didn't fit in or I didn't have many friends. Sometimes, but it's not a giant in my life. In his book, Louis Giglio speaks about the difference between so that or because. Are we serving God so that we can gain his acceptance or because we are already loved and accepted by him? Are we living our lives for God's approval or from it? The third giant is anger. Oh, and there's a lot of angry people about these days. Explosive anger has never been a major giant in my life. I'm more likely to be huffy and sulky and gone a bit quiet. However, I do know what it feels like. There have been 2 occasions in my life, and I can picture these 2 occasions clearly, who I was with, where I was, how I felt, which was a bit like the Incredible Hulk. I could almost feel myself turning green. Sadly, both times with another Christian. But on both those occasions, I suppressed the anger. So how do we deal with the giant of anger? Many years ago, when the ladies used to go to Kathy's Bible study group, we used to listen to a cassette tape and then have discussion questions. The proper way to deal with anger came up, and we learned that anger suppressed, bottled things up, will harm us. It can lead to high blood pressure, stomach ulcers, and heart problems. Anger expressed will hurt others. Once those words are spoken, you can't take them back. The way to deal with anger is not to suppress it or express it, but to confess it. We learned the way to bring down the giant of anger is to confess how you feel to God, to pray for the person you are angry with, and then, I'm not sure how this works for the men, but for the ladies group, it was whatever possible to do a kind thing for the person you are angry with. A little gift, bunch of flowers, packet of biscuits. Perhaps the men have to go out for a pint. Being angry is very tiring because you're not sleeping, you're going over things in your mind, you're rehearsing conversations. Much better to just let it go. There is, of course, righteous anger, which Jesus himself displayed, although he never sinned. Anger over injustice, but that's a different matter and not a giant to be brought down. I was in Spring Harvest last week, had a wonderful week, but they did mention that there are 3 marks to righteous anger. It must be about actual sin, not our own preferences. It must be a violation of God's character, not ours. And it must be expressed in a way which reflects the fruit of the Spirit. Addiction is our next one. Now, if we say addiction, we automatically think of substance abuse. But there are lots of things we can be addicted to, like sugar or shopping. And Louis Giglio writes that 78% of teens and 69% of parents check their phones at least hourly. He says that we can get addicted to anything that promises the rewards we crave. Scientists have shown that we get a hit of dopamine, the chemical linked to happiness, when we hear our phones beep or ring. That little sound says we matter to someone, we are wanted and needed. And we find ourselves checking how many likes we've had on social media. And these things can become addictive. Rob Parsons, who was at Spring Harvest last week from Care for the Family, he was very passionate and quite angry at the damage that we've done to young people with social media. But what about a serious addiction? Many of you will remember our friend Ron. Ron was the first person to come to the Fold Church, and he was a great worker, well liked in the church and the local community. He was a single parent, his home was spotless, and he was always smartly dressed. Many of you will remember Ron's Sunday lunches, which were legendary. But Ron was an alcoholic. He lived at the top of our street, and he was a good friend. However, over the years, the drinking took its toll, and he became psychotic. He left the church, moved house, and didn't want us to know where he'd moved to. We thought of him often and kept a lookout for him, but had no idea where he was. Then a couple of years ago, out of the blue, we heard he was in hospital, so Colin and I went to visit him. Do you know, we were just so pleased to see him again and chatted about old times. And the hospital said he could go home the next day. His clothes were in a bit of a state. So Colin and I went out and we bought him some new ones. But when Colin went to take the clothes the next day, sadly Ron had died. Now I believe that it was God, it wasn't a coincidence that we found out that Ron was in hospital. It wasn't by chance. God had allowed us to hear that Ron was in hospital and we had that little time with him. And I am so grateful to God for that. Now why am I telling you this? When this series is about defeating giants, and Ron obviously didn't defeat his. Ron trusted Jesus for his salvation, but he couldn't trust him enough to overcome the giant of addiction. But the fact that we had that last little time with him proves to me that Ron was still loved by God and that we will see him again in eternity. The church organised his funeral and Paul Oliver took the service, which was great as we remembered Ron in happier days. and we gave him a really good send-off. So even if you're in the middle of a battle, remember, you are loved. No matter how far down a person goes, and Ron certainly hit rock bottom, Jesus is still there. And I believe that Ron was still saved. Now, lastly, comfort. This was a most unexpected giant and quite subtle. And yet the chapter in the book was, for me, the most challenging and convicting. Pastor Paul Reed at our church weekend said that comfort leads to complacency and then to complaining and cynicism. And I am convinced that is true. I see it in my own life. I think of those folk who go out on the coffee cart on Friday evening in the cold, wet weather and admire their commitment for giving up their comfort to serve hot drinks to people leaving the pubs. And there have been times in the past when we've been prepared to give up our comfort to serve God. Colin and I went to Africa with mercy ships for a year. And when we first got there, the ship wasn't there, so we had to stay on the land in a kind of bungalow. But the bed, it was a double bed, and on the first night, I say mattress loosely, but there was a piece of foam rubber on the bed, but it dipped right down in the middle. So you ended up clinging to the outside edge of the bed so that you didn't roll down into the middle because it was so hot. And then when we got onto the ship, we had a little cabin, and there was a sort of sofa bed that pulled out to make a bed at night. But it was so small that if you turned over quickly in bed, you would be in the fridge. But certainly Jesus didn't come here to live a comfortable life or die a comfortable death. He came to fulfill a purpose. I'm just going to ask the band if they would come back up now. Louis Giglio says, nobody who plays a significant role in the plans of God ever did so by choosing the easy route, living in ease or refusing to take a risk. But honestly, this is what I'm still thinking about. In Romans 8:37, the Bible tells us we are more than conquerors. And Joyce Meyer writes that before a battle even begins, we have been told that we will win it. We may not like having to go through our battle, but we can be encouraged. If God is on our side, and if we are on his side, in the end, everything is going to work out for our good, because whoever is with the Lord is on the winning team. Now, I just want you to remember, Christians never lose the war. If we face difficulties in this life, they can make us more like Jesus. They can grow our faith. And even if we die, we have eternity with our Lord to look forward to. So I hope this morning has whet your appetite for what the preachers will bring over the next few weeks as we look at these 5 giants in more detail. Then at the end of the series, Corrine will be looking for folk to share how Jesus has been the giant slayer in their lives. Thank you.
This is the end of this message. We hope you enjoyed it. If you want to find out more about our church, please visit www.chowdean.org.uk. And please take a minute to rate our podcast on iTunes.